Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast.
Welcome to the Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast. I am TC Ricks. This is the next in a series called Making the 20's Roll. This particular episode is about the culture wars, or basically how we should Sherman the culture wars. So specifically the term came from William Tecumseh Sherman, who was a general in the Civil War, arguably a committer of war crimes by today's standards, because he also, in addition to basically winning a series of victories for the Union, basically also destroyed a lot of civilian infrastructure. I have a friend who is a very good friend who has pride in his Southern heritage, probably the only one that has an issue with Sherman. And so I can't laud Sherman as a war hero, but I can say that in terms of imagery in U.S. history, he is so tough that he basically had a tank that was named after him. And the fact of the matter is that when it comes to the actual culture wars, I can't think of a more appropriate image. In other words, the culture war is the only war that matters. Culture is a huge impact on any individual life. And the fact of the matter is that the time for playing nice or both sides are the same when it comes to culture are done, right? I think that the biggest area where everyone in the big tent, except for a few recent immigrants from the tattered remains of the Republican Party, can agree on is culture, right? Centrist Democrats or incrementalist Democrats or progressive Democrats or liberal Democrats may disagree on economic policy, which will actually be a large component of my next podcast. But we can all agree that culture, specifically identity, and protecting identity is paramount. And legislation is great, but we need to be much more thorough in every single institution. And I'm going to name 3 simple ways to do that. This will be a shorter podcast because I want to keep it really simple, even though there's a million ways that this can be done, right? The most important to me is education. I understand that there's a lot of people who like the federal system. And the biggest argument against federalizing something that is not currently federalized is Trump, right? And it's always a really good idea to make that argument in the sense of, well, what happens if a Trump takes over? But the counter argument to that is Trump just got thrown out. And the best way to prevent a further future Trump is federalize education. No more local crazy school boards of crazy Confederate or neo-Confederate or white supremacists, lunatics, teaching our children crazy bullshit should be acceptable. And while I'm not opposed to the idea of private education or private school, there need to be certain minimal federal standards that are real standards for history and social studies and economics and math and reading. And I'm not talking about core curriculum bullshit that has standardized testing. I'm talking about ensuring that the actual course that is taught by the actual teacher does not have neo-Confederate, white supremacist, QAnon bullshit. I think the best source that I can think of to highlight this problem doesn't directly have to do with culture, but at the same time, it totally obviously does. There's an excellent podcast called Nice White Parents that is recommended by the folks that make the other really awesome podcast called Serial, that basically shows how New York City, which is supposed to be a bastion of blue awesomeness, has, until very recently, had some pretty fucking racist bullshit when it came to distribution of resources in the school board, right? And if that was federalized, none of this bullshit would be happening, right? If you are a citizen of the United States of America, you are entitled to an education. And that, by the way, should also be a right that's enlisted in the Constitution. And right now, it's quite clearly a state matter because of the 10th Amendment. But the fact of the matter is that to survive in a post-industrial, much less an information age, first world economy, you cannot have an education that comes from the back of a goddamn cereal box. So in addition to being a matter of just basic economic and civil fairness, the real reason to federalize education is to ensure the culture of the coastal elites basically permeates red state areas. Because here's the thing. With spatial orbital internet approaching, there is nothing that says that somebody in a rural area can't receive a perfectly normal, viable, well-funded federal education taught by people who actually want them to have a real education to ensure that they can either work remotely and have a real education or work in a city and have a real education and a real chance at a job. Now, am I saying that rural areas are inherently evil? I am absolutely not saying that. What I am saying is that right now, many rural areas are basically pro-Trump. And part of that is because there is a lock on cultural input. If you drive from Miami to Atlanta, as we frequently do, there's a huge chunk of territory that has one and only one voice outside of the highly conservative Bible Belt owned radio stations, and that's NPR. And if you know anything about NPR, you know that as good and as awesome as NPR is, they also are held hostage by a lot of rural areas, which are owned by red state interests or co-opted by national red right-wing billionaire foundations. And NPR is hardly the doorway to ensure that our children, future generations, have access to a real education that doesn't say the world is flat, and that doesn't say that Biden stole the election, and that doesn't say that vaccines cause cancer. Our children deserve a shot at an education that ensures that they have modern, scientific, compassionate ideas that don't embrace slavery, that don't embrace white supremacy, and that do not embrace crazy, insane, stupid, disproven theories. And the best way to do that, the best way to win the culture war by fiat, is to federalize education. And that's going to ensure that a lot of Karens who love to go to school meetings and have their friend on the school board in their local, well-funded, white schools get to tilt the curriculum for whatever bullshit that is their particular pet project. Let me assure you, Karen is still going to have a way to ensure that Timmy is disproportionately advantaged with after-school programs, even if education is federalized. I assure you, poor Karen will still find a way to have an economic advantage because rich people always do in every culture in the history of in the history of the world. Because there's always a rich, even in a situation where you have a non-capitalist economy. It's going to happen. But the fact of the matter is that you can do better than what we have now, where whole sections of the country have kids having their education in actual freaking trailers. It's ridiculous. It's unconscionable, and we cannot continue to allow it. We need to federalize education to ensure that the culture of America is shaped by modern, egalitarian, proper ideas and not regressive, nonsensical bullshit. Children have a right, not a privilege, a right to a proper education and a chance to not grow up to be frothtards. They have that right. Parents have a right to raise their children, for now. I'm not entirely convinced that everyone is fit to be a parent, but a child definitely, by fiat, by inherent nature of who and what they are, has not only a right to an education, but a right to not be raised in ignorance. And short of taking children away from their parents, which at least for now seems like a really terrible idea, we need to federalize education in this country. The second cultural change that we need to have happen is to re-sacrosanct unions. We need federal legislation that makes it a crime for a business to, quote, educate, end quote, its workers about the danger of unions. Well, what about free speech? What about free speech? What in the First Amendment says that corporations have a right to lie to their employees about unionization? If you lie to your employees or intimidate or in any way misinform them about their right to unionize, then you should lose your corporate shield. And if we did that, you would see a lot more unions in this country. And if you saw more unions, you would get us closer to actual universal basic income. You would ensure that employees have enough protections in this country to withstand the AI and other technical problems that are coming down the pipeline. And then last but not least, we need a federal Department of Culture. Kind of like what we have with the National Endowment for the Arts, but something that works kind of like the Transportation Department, is a cabinet level position that is automatically tied by formula to funding for the military. Now, it doesn't have to be 1-on-1, although that would be nice, but it has to be X amount, right? So if you increase funding for the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Defense, you automatically increase it for the cultural department, right? If you can afford another 12,000 useless bombers that don't work, or a rocket like the SLS that doesn't work, you can afford to spend half of that on art programs for schools or state symphonies. And the fact of the matter is that art and the elevation thereof helps actually create culture, which helps reduce ignorance, which helps reduce white supremacy, and helps increase empathy. Because it gives artists, who are usually some of the most empathic people in society, a way to earn a living without working in a restaurant, scrambling for tables, and instead doing what they should be doing. This has been the Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast. Buy my book, Have Name Will Travel, at Amazon and other markets. RedAnvilCreative.com contains all our podcasts. Copyright 2021.
To fight the forces of evil!